Again, we apologize. Tomorrow we are going to have the same program in the other side that's naturally divided, and we have better equipment there. It's just for today. And this is a 2-lecture series or workshop. So Hujjatul Islam al-Muslimin, Sayyid Sulayman, will be here to share a lot of information and give us a lot of knowledge. So make sure you have enough water and chai and stuff like that. Jazakallah khair.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي أما بعد. So inshallah, today we will take a look at a very important document, a treasure that we have in Islamic tradition, one of the vessels of the wisdom of Ahlul Bayt, known as Risalat ul-Huquq, the treatise on rights. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. How many of you have heard of Risalat ul-Huquq before this session or our announcement? Right? So about maybe 50%, if the hands are accurate. How many of you have read Risalat ul-Huquq? All right. It's about half of those who raised your hands. And how many of you are courageous enough to say that this is the first you're hearing about the existence of this book? So we have a few people who will admit that. Risalat al-Huquq is one of those very important documents which has been transmitted widely and is an authentic or an authenticated repository of the teachings of one of our Imams, our fourth Imam, Imam Ali ibn al-Husayn Zainul Abidin alayhim as-salam. And as will become clear, there is a connection between this text and our devotion in the month of Ramadan. And so it's appropriate for us to try to connect to this work during this month. Now, this is a very complex book, not very long, but very profound, very deep. And so in 2 sessions over 2 nights, that too after iftar, we are not going to be able to go through all of the profundity, but inshallah we will have an overview and an introduction to the book, and that will be an opportunity for us to continue further study and to learn the lessons that come from this work. This is a book that you want to refer to periodically. Sometimes we get bored of things that we have read or that we are familiar with, but Risalat al-Huquq, as you will see, is a book that serves as a reminder. And it is meant to take things from sort of our subconscious and to bring them into our conscious mind and into our practical life. That requires us not just to be familiar or to know, but to remember and to practice. So let's begin. I'd like to start by introducing the researcher that compiled some of the different versions of the text. I'll talk a little bit about those details, and published Risalat al-Huquq. And the reason why I want to spotlight the scholar who did that work is that he just passed away at about the age of 80 years old in Qom on the 1st of Ramadan of this year. So just about a week ago, he passed away after a lifetime of teaching and researching. He has hundreds of books that he has edited, brought back to life from manuscript form in a way that isn't accessible. Many times manuscripts are difficult to read, or they are incomplete, or because they were written by a student or a non-native speaker of Arabic, they may have errors in them. And so it's a difficult task to research and to bring them back to usable form, to bring them to life. He also was an author with many books and articles to his name. So for Marhum Sayyid Muhammad Rida al-Jalali, let's recite Surah Al-Fatiha, inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahmanir Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'een. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Some of you may have heard of his older brother. They look very similar. If you just see the picture, Sayyid Muhammad Hussain Jalali, who lived for several decades and passed away a few years ago in Chicago. He was also a very senior scholar and a teacher and a researcher. Several brothers from this family, the Jalali family, they were scholars, fuqaha, jurists, and have contributed a lot to reviving the heritage of Ahlul Bayt. One of the ways that we can honor that scholarship and pay our debt to them, as we will see described by Imam Zainul Abidin himself, is by benefiting from and learning from the work that they have produced. So Risalat ul-Huquq is a text that is narrated from our fourth Imam, Imam Ali ibn al-Hussein Zainul Abidin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And we all are familiar with our Imam, but just for barakah and as a reminder, he was born in Medina, according to narrations, on the 5th of Sha'ban, in the year 38 after Hijrah. So about 30 years, a little less than 30 years after the death of our Prophet. And that means that he was just over 22 years of age at the time of Karbala, when he was present, and of course, not just present in Karbala, but he was the one who carried the torch of the message of Imam Hussein and instituted the remembrance of Karbala and the sacrifice of the martyrs and the path of the martyrs. Risalatul Huquq is one of the ways that Imam Zainul Abidin kept alive that message, although it doesn't mention Karbala. But as we will see in the content, this is one of the ways in which Imam Zainul Abidin preserved the message of Karbala. The Imam survived for about 33 or 34 years after the tragedy of Karbala. According to narrations, he passed away, he was martyred on the 25th of Muharram, either in 94 or 95 AH. So about 34 years after the tragedy of Karbala took place. And although the Imam had a kunya, normally in that time people were known by their kunya, by their affiliation or by their name that attributed them to their son or sometimes to their daughter. So Prophet Muhammad had the kunya Abul Qasim. Imam Ali had the kunya Abul Hassan. Imam Hassan had the kunya Abu Muhammad. Imam Hussein had the kunya Abu Abdullah. You say, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. So there was a kunya. And uniquely, Imam Zainul Abidin is really not known by his kunya. And that is because he became so well known by his titles. And this is also part of the uniqueness of his character, that his attribute of worship and piety and devotion became so synonymous with who he was that the titles attributing him to piety, to purity, to worship, they almost eclipsed his name, Ali, and his kunya, or his patronymic, which is reported as being either Abu Muhammad or Abul Hussein or Abul Hassan. There are different kuna, there are different titles or patronymics that are attributed to the Imam, but he is known by titles. Most famously, Zainul Abidin, or sometimes Sayyidul Abidin, the adornment of the worshippers or the chief of the worshippers. Dhuthafanat. Dhuthafanat is the person who has calluses on his hands, on his knees, on his feet, because of the frequency and the duration of his worship. So he would go so frequently into prostration and do so many prayers that calluses developed on those parts of his body that were in contact with the ground. And that mark of prostration on his forehead and on his body, that became one of the signs by which Imam Zain al-Abidin was known. So dhuthafanat, you can say the person with many calluses, but those calluses are formed because of the frequency and the duration of worship. And he was also known as as-Sajjad, the one who made frequent and lengthy prostration, az-Zaki, with Zai, which means the pure, and al-Amin, the one who is trusted. And some of these titles, they have stories associated with him. In particular, the way in which he gave shelter and protection even to the families of his enemies and the enemies of Ahlul Bayt, how he gave protection to the family of Marwan, who was an enemy of Ahlul Bayt and an enemy of Imam Ali in the battle of Jamal, and whose animosity to Ahlul Bayt continued afterwards. But when Abdullah ibn Zubair took power in Hijaz, the Marwanid family felt that they were in danger. And Imam Zain al-Abidin provided protection to the women, the children, and the property of Marwan ibn al-Hakam. So there was a very great trust that Imam Zain al-Abidin upheld. This is just one instance, but his character and his upholding of the trust gave him the title Al-Amin, which is the same title that his grandfather, the Prophet of Allah, also had. So Imam Zain al-Abidin is the author or the source of Risalat al-Huquq. It's narrated from one of his companions, Abu Hamza al-Thumali. And all of you are familiar with Abu Hamza al-Thumali. He is best known as the one who also narrated a lengthy dua from Imam Zain al-Abidin, which is known as Dua Abi Hamza al-Thumali. It's recited in particular in the month of Ramadan. This is one of the reasons why we are looking at Risalat al-Huquq in the month of Ramadan, because the personality of its narrator, its transmitter, Abu Hamza al-Thumali, is associated with worship, in particular in the month of Ramadan. So Dua Abi Hamza al-Thumali, you can find it in Mafatihul Jinan, you can read it in Arabic or in translation. It's a lengthy dua. If you read it at a gradual pace, maybe it'll take almost an hour to recite. It's a very beautiful and a very intimate dua. In addition, Abu Hamza al-Thumali is also the author of a tafsir work. This tafsir work does not survive until today. If it survived, it would be a very valuable work because it was from a direct companion of Imam Zain al-Abidin and our later Imams. But it is quoted in some sources. It appears that it survived until the 6th century of Hijrah. So for about 400 years or so after Imam Zain al-Abidin's time, after Abu Hamza al-Thumali's time, this tafsir was still in circulation. It was quoted by different scholars, and then the original work was lost. We have scattered reports on tafsir from Abu Hamza al-Thumali, which might have come from this source on tafsir. He also has a book of nawadir. Nawadir would refer to books that transmit the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt. So that was a work which transmitted ahadith of Ahlul Bayt. He has this famous work, Risalat al-Huquq, which we are going to be discussing today and tomorrow. Dua Abi Hamza al-Thumali. And then there are many reports on fiqh, which are scattered in different books of hadith that are narrated from Ahlul Bayt. Abu Hamza al-Thumali according to a narration attributed to our 8th Imam, Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rida alayhi as-salam, Allahumma salli ala, was said to have the status of Salman al-Farisi in his time. Abu Hamza fi zamanihi ka Salman fi zamanihi. As you know, Salman was the recipient of many of the very secret and intimate teachings of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt. He was very close to Ahlul Bayt at the highest level of faith. And according to this hadith of Imam Ali Rida alayhi salam, Abu Hamza al-Thumali had a similar role of great trust that he held from Ahlul Bayt and being the recipient of some of their very secret and very special teachings. So there's a special place that he had. And he also was contemporary to 4 of our Imams. So Imam Zainul Abidin, from whom he narrated Risalat al-Huquq, from whom he narrated Dua Abi Hamza al-Thumali, and then Imam Muhammad Baqir alayhi salam, Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam, and Imam Musa al-Kadhim, as Imam Sallallahu Muhammad. So Imam Musa al-Kadhim, he assumed the imamat in, anybody know what year? It's not a quiz, but when did Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam die, or when was he martyred? 148. So that was 2 years before the death of Abu Hamza al-Thumali. So just a small portion of the imamat of Imam Musa Kadhim, maybe 2 years or under 2 years, he was able to be companion of Imam Musa Kadhim as well. Primarily though, Imam Zainul Abidin, Imam Muhammad Baqir, and Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq. Now if we assume that Abu Hamza al-Thumali might have been about 25 years of age when Imam Zainul Abidin died, then that would place his birth around 70 AH. And if his death was in the year 150, he lived perhaps about 80 years of age, maybe 75 to 80 years, depending on how old he was at the time of the imamat of Imam Zainul Abidin. But he was very young at that time. As Imam Zainul Abidin, he died in the year 95, right, or 94. So it's possible that Abu Hamza al-Thumali was only in his teens or in his 20s at that time, and even at that young age, he had achieved a position of such trust that Imam Zainul Abidin gave him 2 very profound teachings, one of which we're going to be looking at in detail today, and the other one, Dua Abi Hamza al-Thumali, I hope that we will have an opportunity to benefit from during this month as well. So before we turn to Risalat al-Huquq in particular, let's just bring to mind the historical context and circumstances in which this text was taught by the Imam. Remember that the time of Imam Zainul Abidin was the time in which the Umayyad dynasty was at the height of its power and its tyranny. Right after Karbala, there was a kind of civil war between the Umayyads and the Zubayrids. And that lasted for almost a decade, in which you can say that the greater influence and geographical spread was on the part of the Zubayrids. Abdullah ibn Zubayr established a caliphate in Hijaz. And his governors, they also ruled in Iraq, in Persia, Khurasan, and the Umayyads were kind of on the back foot until the Sufyanid branch of the Umayyads was defeated, and then what was known as the Marwanid branch, they assumed power. Marwan ibn al-Hakam, and then his sons. So Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, he united the territory of the Muslim world and expanded and strengthened the reach of the Muslim empire. So, the greatest extent, military and political and economic power of the Umayyad Empire, that was during the time, not really of Marwan himself, but his son Abdul Malik. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, some of you may have heard that name, was the governor of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. He ruled very tyrannically with an iron fist in Iraq, and this was the height of the power of the Umayyads. Later on, at the end period of Imam Baqir and Imam Sadiq's lifetime, the Umayyad power was weakened, and then it came to an end, and the Abbasids came to power. But in the time of Imam Zainul Abidin, the Umayyad caliphs, particularly the two sons of Marwan, Abdul Malik, or then I should say the descendants of Marwan, Abdul Malik, and then the son of Abdul Malik, Walid ibn Abdul Malik, they ruled. And then after that there were three other sons of Abdul Malik who ruled after the time of Imam Zainul Abidin. So at that time of political power, you can imagine that there were a lot of people who would say, you know, what use do we have to learn this theoretical text about rights and responsibilities and relationships? Have today, when you have political chaos, every day there is a new headline, and a lot of people, they have sort of a hesitation to do any deep study because you think the world is going to come to an end, or you think that there's too much going on and you can't bring yourself to focus on something that doesn't seem to be politically or economically relevant. This is now the wisdom that we learn from Imam Zainul Abidin, that whatever is going on in society and in politics, when you want to respond, you don't just want to get caught up in the headlines and in the chaos, but you want to build a deep foundation of insight and wisdom. And sometimes that means that you block off the chaos and learn and study so that when the time comes, you or your children or grandchildren, they will be able to respond to circumstances with wisdom and with depth. So the time of Imam Zainul Abidin was not a time that facilitated study. It was a time of political turmoil and great oppression. Generally speaking, the intellectual pursuits of the Muslim world at large were not in line with Risalat ul-Huquq, which Imam Zainul Abidin taught to Abu Hamza. His name was Thabit ibn Dinar, and his kunya was Abu Hamza. What were the major intellectual pursuits of the Muslim world at that time? One of them, of course, was Arabic, because this was a time when new non-Arab groups were entering into Islam. Some of them spoke languages similar to Arabic, like Aramaic, and others of them, they spoke languages which are very different from Arabic. Persian, later on Turkish, Sindhi, and other languages. So many of them, they had to learn how to read the Quran, they had to learn how to speak Arabic, and that was a major pursuit of Islamic scholarship, to preserve and to teach Arabic, both now to the new generation of people who may be of Arabic descent, and to people from non-Arabic backgrounds who were entering into Islam. Because it was also the language of government and trade, Arabic was also being studied and learned by non-Muslims, but especially by Muslims. And much of that was in order to be able to learn the Quran. So it wasn't a deep study of the Quran so much as it was memorization, and the preservation of the text of the Quran was a major focus of study at the time, and fiqh. You had different fuqaha. Now teaching, at this time, there were 7 fuqaha well known in Medina. Later you had equal prominence for Kufa and other centers of learning, and people, they would establish schools of law. This is before any of the Sunni schools of law were established. So Abu Hanifa, he died at the same time as Abu Hamza al-Thumali. He would have been a very young man. He was born, Abu Hanifa was born in the year 80 AH. So he would have been a very young man at the time when Imam Zainul Abidin was the Imam and when Imam Zainul Abidin was martyred. So these formal schools of law, they were not yet established. It was in the infancy, the study of law. What major Islamic field do you not see on this list? Hadith. Right? You would think that, all right, when you're talking about intellectual pursuits of the Muslim, hadith should be prominent. Well, the reality is, and we don't have time to talk about this in detail, hadith did not become a major field of study until well after the time of Imam Zainul Abidin. And this is one of those issues that sometimes within the general telling of Muslim history, especially within the Sunni world, is not given sufficient attention, that later on you had books of hadith, sahih books that were written, but that first 3-generation period of Islam, there was no formal study of hadith. So all of those books, they rest on a shaky foundation, because the formalization of that transmission, it didn't exist. So in this time, you had people studying and teaching Arabic, you had people teaching and studying Quran, you had people teaching and studying fiqh, you had people telling stories and narrations about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the companions, but there wasn't any kind of formal study of hadith or transmission of texts or of chains of transmission. That didn't come until later. Now, within this context, Risalat al-Huquq can be seen as the message of Imam Zainul Abidin that the foundation of Islamic teachings is justice. And if justice is the foundation, then justice means that you know what are the rights and the obligations that define our life. And so, Imam Zainul Abidin, it's not that theology or fiqh or Quran or hadith were not important. But for all of the teachings of Islam to fit together and to be properly understood, to be properly implemented, we have to have an understanding of justice, of our role within creation, of the various obligations that we have on our shoulders. And Risalat al-Huquq sets that foundation. So it's a very important book, but you can see the uniqueness in that it was a little bit removed from the general interest and focus of intellectual efforts in the Muslim world at the time. And that's part of the beauty of the book. You can pause for any questions, and then we can move on, inshallah, to look towards the text. All right. So Risalat al-Huquq, it has one transmitter. Imam Zainul Abidin taught this work. One companion narrated it from the Imam, that was Thabit ibn Dinar, Abu Hamza al-Thumali. Some ahadith of the Imams, they have multiple transmitters who narrate directly from the Imam. In this case, we have one transmitter narrating directly from the Imam, but then there are several transmissions that go back to Abu Hamza. And we have it in a number of different sources. Many of you are familiar with the scholar Shaykh Saduq. He is a very important scholar in Islamic history, particularly in the transmission of ahadith. He has a well-known book, Kamaluddin wa Tamamun Ni'ma, or Ikmaluddin wa Itmamun Ni'ma, about the 12th Imam and about Imamat in general, particularly about the ghaiba or the occultation of the 12th Imam. He has a book on fiqh known as Man La Yahdhuruhu al-Faqih, which is one of the 4 main books of fiqh in the Shi'i tradition. And he has numerous books of hadith which deal with different theological topics like Kitab al-Tawheed, and ethical topics like al-Khisal, and many other books, some of which survive, some of which do not survive, but they have indirect reports in other sources. So a very important scholar. He preserves several narrations of Risalat al-Huquq in 2 of his works, al-Khisal and a book called al-Amali. So it's one scholar preserving Risalat al-Huquq, but these versions are not the same. And also in Man La Yahdhuruhu al-Faqih, which is not on the slide. So he has several different versions of the text. Then there is a scholar who was a contemporary of Sheikh Tusi, known as al-Najashi. And his main work that we have is what's known as a fihrist. It's kind of a bibliography of Shia works up until his time. So he was a contemporary of Sheikh Tusi. He died 10 years before Sheikh Tusi in the year 450. He has a work, it's published, it's very well studied in scholarly circles today, in which he lists the people who wrote books and preserved the ahadith of Ahlul Bayt, and sometimes the names of those books. So the value of this book is that it gives us an idea of which books were in circulation from the students of Ahlul Bayt, and who were the transmitters. So he mentions that he has a chain of transmission to Abu Hamza and to Risalat al-Huquq. But he doesn't transmit the text, it's a bibliography. So a bibliography doesn't have the text, but it tells you the chain of transmission of the text, and it can be used to authenticate a text. And then we have a version, which I have the copy of the book here, it's called Tuhaful Uqul an al-Rasul. This is a book which is a very mysterious book. It's by an author known as Ibn Shu'ba al-Harrani, and he was an author presumably somewhat contemporary to Sheikh Saduq. We don't know much about him. And he wrote a book, I think it's translated into English as well, one of the most beautiful collections of ahadith of Ahlul Bayt. A very good selection, largely of ahadith from an akhlaqi perspective. But the author is virtually unknown. And this book has no mention for a good 500-600 years, until in the early Safavid period it was discovered, presumably hidden away in some library, and it came to light when the Shia acquired some economic and political power. And when it was discovered, it was found that not all, but a large number of the ahadith in this book are also found in other sources. So for example, in this case, the text that we have in Tuhaful Uqul is also narrated by Sheikh Saduq in several of his works. And what's interesting is that in the case of Risalat al-Huquq and in some other cases, the version that's found in Tuhaful Uqul is often more complete, or a better preserved version than the form of the hadith that we may have in other sources. So whoever the author was, he was a top-rate scholar, and not only that, he had access to very good texts. Because you can be a good scholar But if the manuscript you're working from has a lot of mistakes, then you're not going to change or modify that manuscript. It's not your mistake that you might be transmitting, but the sources that you are using, they may have grammatical mistakes or certain things that are confused. So what we can say is that Ibn Shu'bah al-Harrani, one of the reasons why he may not have been known is that his work was largely in Nusayri circles. So he was not really in the mainstream of Shia Ithna Ashari scholarship, but was working in a different environment, and therefore his works, at least initially, they didn't enter into the Shia mainstream. Therefore, the general opinion among scholars is that if there is a hadith that's found in Tuhaf al-Uqul, but we don't find a similar text in a more authentic source, like Al-Kafi, or the works of Shaykh Saduq, then you can't rely on it. Because some of the sources that he may have been using, we don't know what they are, and we can't be 100% sure that they're accurate. But if there is a source that is found in more authentic Shia sources, and also found in Tuhaf al-Uqul, it might be that the version in this book is worth looking at, and it may be more accurate than the other sources. That's what our researcher, Marhum Jalali, says. He says, although we have a version of Risalat ul-Huquq, which is narrated with a chain of transmission by a very prominent, well-known scholar, Shaykh Saduq, I'm going to use the version in Tuhaf al-Uqul as my baseline, because it is more complete and it's a better text. But then he also makes notes of the differences. That's a very important point. Is it clear? Sometimes, and this is also coming from the Sunni tradition, people have this confusion that you just look at the sanad. And the sanad is what gives you the authentication of a text. The sanad is important, because if you don't have a chain of custody, even in a criminal investigation, you can't use evidence if you don't have a clear chain of custody, otherwise the evidence can be contaminated. In the case of a hadith, if you don't have a clear chain of custody and a reliable chain of transmission, maybe somebody added something. Maybe something was removed accidentally or deliberately. So it's important to have a chain of transmission. But the text itself is also important evidence independent of the chain of transmission. Sometimes you can go to the market, buy a book, you don't know who wrote it and who sold it, but you can look at the text and you can see that it is a very scholarly or a very well-written, well-preserved book. And you can use that to compare and to authenticate other versions. So this is something that is an insight that our Shi'i scholars have had throughout history. By the way, this is one reason why in the Shia world we don't have Sahih books of hadith. We don't have Sahih Bukhari's equivalent. We don't have Sahih Muslim's equivalent. Why? Because we don't limit ourselves to narrations that have a clear chain of transmission. That's a limitation. It's not an authentication. It's a weakness, not a strength. Yes, if you have a good chain of transmission, that hadith deserves some prominence. But if you have a hadith, because of historical circumstance, you don't know all of the details of the chain of transmission, there's still important evidence. It might be circumstantial evidence, but it's still important for you to study and to learn, and sometimes that can actually help you complete the picture that is missing from those quote-unquote sahih ahadith. So any questions so far? Go ahead.
So why do they use Ibn Shu'bah as like a more authentic narration of like some of them? Is it because like it's older source?
It's not necessarily older, but our scholars would work with sources that they had. And I'll talk a little bit about this in just a moment. But for various reasons, let's say, for example, you have scholar A and scholar B, right? Scholar A is a better scholar. But in the days before printing, he's using a version of a book that has copying errors, right? The version of the book that he's using was written by a second-year student, because all books were handwritten, remember, before printing. And so the version of the book that he's using, sometimes instead of writing Hussein ibn Ali, it writes Hassan ibn Ali. Or instead of saying Hussein ibn Ali, it says Hussein an Ali. So it messes up the chain. Instead of giving you the proper name, it makes it two different names. And these kinds of copying errors can creep up. Then the other scholar, who is a lesser scholar, he just happens to get a more expertly written version of the book. Now, which one would you prefer?
Well, how do you determine that it's expertly written?
And that's what the comparison of texts will tell you. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But that's a scholarly thing, that you look at the text. If you know Arabic, then you can tell mistakes in Arabic. If you know the science of hadith, then you can tell, for example, if in quoting names, there are mistakes, right, in writing a name. So sometimes you might have, let's say, the name Humayd. If you write it sloppily, it might look like Jamil. So if I know what the name is supposed to be, and one source says Jamil and one source says Humayd, it doesn't sound the same. But if you write it in Arabic, it can kind of be a dal and a lam are not that different. A dot on the jim or the lack of a dot on ha are not that different. If I know the name, I can say, oh, wait a minute, this is a better source. Because I know this person is named Humayd, it's not named Jamil. Does it make sense? So the text of Risalat al-Huquq, it discusses 50 rights. And this is one of the ways that we can authenticate. Because some of them are broken down differently in different versions, or mentioned differently. So first of all, there is an introduction to the book. And that introduction is missing from some of the versions that Sheikh Saduq transmits. But Tuhaf al-Uqul's version mentions that complete introduction. Now, you might say, well, why would Sheikh Saduq not mention the introduction? If he was a greater scholar, then why did he not mention the introduction? And the answer to that is, when you quote something, do you always quote from A to Z what somebody says? No. You often will quote, let's say there's a Jum'ah khutbah, and one part of it is relevant to something that you're discussing with a friend, you'll quote that 5-minute selection of the Jum'ah khutbah. Or these days, you'll send the 1-minute video rather than the full half-an-hour video. So Sheikh Saduq, because one of his books was a book of law, Al-Khisal was, quote-unquote, a book of etiquette and ethics. So he'll quote that portion that's relevant to that work, and not necessarily the whole work. It's not that he's censoring anything, or it's not that the complete version was not in his possession, but it might just not be relevant to the work that he is writing. So he will trust that people have other ways to get to the original source. Sheikh Saduq didn't know, for example, that the transmission might not be so widespread in the future. He just quoted one selection. But one of the things that we can see is Tuhaf al-Uqul is complete. But then there are some things that are missing. So for example, one of the rights that we'll talk about is the right of Hajj. Sheikh Saduq's versions mention the right of Hajj. But Tuhaf al-Uqul, that version is missing the right of Hajj. So you can see that there's some things that might be missing in the versions transmitted by Shaykh Saduq, they're missing the introduction. Then there might be one portion that's missing from Tuhaf al-Uqul's version, like the mention of Hajj. When he mentions the different acts of worship, that one is missing. So by combining the different versions, Marhum Jalali was able to come together with a complete text that's a composite, drawing on all of the different sources and trying to bring them together. So the variations are partially variations in text. But then there's also variations in numbering. So if Risalat al-Huquq in the version of Tuhaf al-Uqul is missing Hajj, does that mean he says that there are 49 rights? No. 50, but then one right is counted that maybe more accurately should not be counted separately. Right? Just to draw a comparison, you know Surah Al-Fatiha is how many verses? 7. But then some people, they think that Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is not part of Surah Al-Fatiha. So what do? They divide the last verse in 2. They still have 7 verses, but it's a different 7 verses that's missing Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. You see the difference? The text of Surah Al-Fatiha, at least from Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen until the end, is the same. But the breakdown of verses is different. So similarly here you have a different breakdown. But there's 50 rights that Imam Zain al-Abidin mentions. Now just to clarify maybe a question that might come into mind, does that mean that we should lose confidence in the authenticity of hadith transmissions? Well, first of all, Risalat al-Huquq is a lengthy text. And remember that in the time of Imam Zain al-Abidin, given the state of society and politics, and also given the state of technology, you didn't have paper. So you still had primitive writing means, parchment and papyrus, and these means of writing were few and far between. They were much more expensive than later on when paper came into the Muslim world and it became cheaper and more abundant to write. So given the state of technology, given the state of society, lengthy texts often just could not be preserved with 100% accuracy. Smaller ahadith, it was much easier to memorize, and it was much easier to dictate and write down and preserve almost with perfect accuracy. But longer texts that are many pages long, that was often just not really feasible. So 2 main reasons are that you would sometimes have selections that are chosen and abbreviation of the text. That's called ikhtisar. That's natural. We do it all the time. Right now, if somebody asks you what was discussed in the Risalat al-Huquq workshop, every one of you might quote 1 or 2 things that you found interesting, and then you might, skip certain things that, I don't know, Sayyid Sulayman, he was droning out about something, I didn't really think it was relevant, so I'm not going to mention it. It's just natural that you will abbreviate. I will not begrudge you if you do that for this session as well. And another thing is that people would often quote things by paraphrasing. So they convey the gist and the meaning of what was said, but not necessarily the exact words. And that's called an-naql bil-ma'na, and that was common particularly for long texts. Du'as, poetry would often be memorized word for word. But prose is often memorized, you internalize the meaning and then you explain it in your own words. So that's why you have certain differences. Having said that, if you put the 3 or 4 different versions of the text side by side, they are very, very similar. There's some paraphrasing, there's some abbreviation, but there's a great deal of correspondence in the text, more than 90% correspondence in the text. All right, so now when we come to the actual text of Risalat al-Huquq, if you have a question, just please raise your hand and interrupt me at any point.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
So based on what you just said, so can we say with confidence that the words or the text we have right now are, like, let's say 90%, 95% real words of Imam, or they are like nakal bil mana?
We can say that where the texts correspond, let's say more than 90%, that is almost certainly the exact words of the Imam. Or the best we can say is that that is the exact words of Abu Hamza al-Thumali, right? But presumably he wrote down the text. And he took it to Kufa where he lived, and then he probably transmitted it in different periods, maybe over time, to different people. So given the degree of respect that Abu Hamza al-Thumali had in Shia history and in the eyes of the Imams, we can say with confidence that he was preserving the exact words of the Imams and not paraphrasing. And therefore we can say with a high degree of certainty that these are the exact words of the Imam. But if it had been a different narrator who was not as prominent and as high a scholar as Abu Hamza al-Thumali, then we might say, well, maybe the original narrator was also paraphrasing. But in his case, the original narrator would have preserved the exact words of the Imams. It's subsequent narrators that may have summarized or paraphrased a little bit, based on the circumstances in which they were writing the text. Does that answer your question? Another thing to bear in mind is that we do have other ahadith that we can authentically attribute to Imam Zainul Abidin. So the du'as of As-Sahifa Sajjadiyya, inshallah we'll have an opportunity for a similar session to talk about Sahifa Sajjadiyya, and you can see a similarity. And that also gives us even further confidence that these are the exact words of the Imam and not just the transmission of the text, because everybody has a certain way of speaking. There's certain phrases, certain patterns that are associated with a person, and there's a great similarity between Risalat ul-Huquq and Sahifa Sajjadiyya and some of the other du'as of Imam Zainul Abidin. So in the introduction to Risalat ul-Huquq, the Imam, he sets that foundation. Remember I said there's a connection with Karbala? So the essence of Karbala is that you stand up for what is right. Not because Imam Hussein was personally offended that, I'm better than Yazid, and therefore I want to be in charge. It wasn't interests, it wasn't emotion, but it was principle. And that principle is justice. And justice is not just economic justice or political justice, but first and foremost, justice is a spiritual and a religious concept. So zalim, we think of an oppressor as somebody who oppresses other people. But in the Quran, shirk is a great dhulm, a great injustice. Okay, if I associate partners with God, I don't even tell you, I don't preach to you, I don't oppress you, am I doing an injustice? Why is, in Surah Luqman, why is shirk dhulmun azim? Because I'm doing an injustice to myself. Even if I'm not stealing from you or imprisoning you. So Islam, it very beautifully reorients our understanding of that very basic concept of justice and injustice. Yes, economic justice is important, social and political justice are important, but at its essence, justice is a matter of religion and a matter of piety and spirituality. That's why the greatest injustice is to reject the truth and to reject God. And the greatest injustice that you can do is to yourself. Because I cannot send anybody else to hell. The worst injustice that I can do is to harm their material interests. Take their life, take their property, take their honor. But if I am a polytheist, or if I am sinful, the harm that I do to myself is not just my material interests or my physical life or my honor, it's to my very soul for all eternity. That's the greatest injustice. So Risalat ul-Huquq, it sets that understanding of justice on a very profound foundation in great detail. 50 rights are enumerated. And that is what allows us to understand the mission of Imam Hussein to establish justice on a much deeper level. There's 7 categories of rights that Imam Zainul Abidin mentions. The source and the greatest right is the right of God. Then there are the rights of your actions, worship and other actions or deeds. Then there are the rights of your imams. The term used is a'imma, but it can be leaders in a general sense. The rights of your subordinates, people under your control or under your authority. The rights of your family, and then other rights, or the rights of others. Just to read the first sentence from the introduction, you can see the way in which Imam Zainul Abidin introduces these rights. I'lam rahimakallah. Know, may Allah have mercy on you. Anna lillahi alayka huquqan. That God has certain rights. Muhitatun laka fi kulli harakatin taharraktaha. They surround you in every movement that you make. O sakanatin sakantaha. Or in every time you kind of stop and you stand still, then even in that inertia, there are rights that Allah has that you are responsible for that are muhitatun bik, that surround you. O manzilatin nazaltaha, or any manzil, any place that you alight in. O jarihatin qallabtaha, wa alatin tasarrafta biha. Or in any limb that you use, or any apparatus or any tool that you make use of. And then some of them are more important than others. All of these rights are not of equal importance. بعضها أكبر من بعض وأكبر حقوق الله عليك ما أوجبه لنفسه. And the most important is the right of God. So that is the first right that Imam Zainul Abidin mentions. The greatest right that we have is to worship Allah and to ascribe no partners to Him. Then Imam Zainul Abidin says that if you do this, Allah will do 2 things for you. One is that He will take care of your affairs in this world and in the hereafter. أن يكفيك أمر الدنيا والآخرة. And that He will preserve for you those things that you love in this world and in the hereafter. He will protect and preserve and safeguard the things that you love in this world, and in the hereafter Allah will take care of your affairs. So this is the right of Allah. Then the Imam moves on to the rights of yourself. Now, remember I said that there were some places where there is a difference in enumeration. Like in Surah Al-Fatiha, there is a difference of opinion. When does the 7th ayah begin? What is the breakdown? So this is one of those instances. Because the Imam says, وَأَمَّا حَقُّ نَفْسِكَ عَلَيْكَ. The right of your soul or yourself upon you. And then, as part of yourself or your soul, what is yourself? But your faculties and your limbs and your organs. That is what yourself is, right? You are not separate from what you see and what you hear and what you think. That is what constitutes yourself. So you have حَقُّ نَفْسِكَ, and then فَتُؤَدِّيَ إِلَى لِسَانِكَ حَقَّهُ. You give to your tongue its right. وَإِلَى سَمْعِكَ حَقَّهُ. You give to your hearing its right. وَإِلَى بَصَرَكَ حَقَّهُ. You give to your seeing or your eyes its right, and so on. So some people have said that the nafs, the soul, is one, and then the tongue, and the hearing and the seeing, that is number 2, number 3, number 4. Does that make sense? So God is number 1. Then after God, nafs. Then after nafs, you have the individual organs. What Sayyid Jalali says is that looking at the context, nafs is not a separate right. The Imam is just introducing that we go from God to yourself. And then the first right of yourself is that of the tongue. The second right is that of your hearing. So we're not counting nafs separately. Nafs is just the overall title for all of your organs and limbs. Right? The version that I have doesn't do that. It numbers the right of God, the right of the nafs, the right of the tongue, and so on. So it counts them separate. See how that difference works? That, of course, is a numbering, which is an editorial policy. It's not, Imam Zayn al-Abidin didn't number the rights. He just said there's 50 in total. So this is just an idea. I'm not going to go through the details after this, but I wanted to just give a flavor and an idea of how that different understanding works when an editor is confronting the text and trying to, publish an edition of the text. The meaning is the same. So we go from God, who is the source and the origin of all rights and obligations and relationships that we have, and then you have to come to yourself. If you don't understand your role as a human being, sometimes we have an inflated version of our own role. We think that we are very special. What do they call that? Main character syndrome, I think, or something like that. What's the word that you guys use? Is that it? Yeah, main character. You think you always have to be the hero of every story. Sometimes you're an extra in life. You're not a main character. Right? Other times we don't have enough of a sense of our own obligation and importance. We say, what can I do? I can't make a difference. I'm just one person. So no, you have to understand what is the role and the responsibility that Allah has created you. Don't inflate your own role, but don't deflate it or downplay it either. I saw a few hands with questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that the 50 rights, is it like you doing injustice and like, like how for Imam Hussein it was the external justice done on, while these 50 rights are these more related to doing injustice ourselves.
We'll talk about the 50 rights. We'll summarize, but we'll be talking about them. Inshallah, we'll do hopefully 20 today, and then the remainder, inshallah, we'll look at tomorrow. So you'll see that, what are the rights that Imam Zayn al-Abidin mentions. It's not all of the rights that we have, but it's 50 foundational rights that sets the foundation for our understanding of our place in the world. Our relationship to God, to ourselves, to our actions, and to other people, as we saw in the introduction. Right?
So, the injustice that was done upon, like Imam Hussein, like was it like some of the rights that were being, taken away from him, right? What is the, because a lot of Imams didn't go into war for rights being taken away from him. What is the ones?
Well, when we say that Imam Hussein was oppressed, it's not just that the right was taken away from him. The best framework is to say that the obligation and the right that was ordained by God was not observed. That is an injustice to Imam Hussein. It is an injustice to the self. It is an injustice to all of humanity. It is an injustice to future generations. We don't always think about that. But when Imam Hussein was deprived of his right, that injustice, it means that for many people in future generations, they didn't know what was the true Islam. There were probably many people who would have lovingly and willingly converted to Islam, but they said, I'm not going to ever join Islam, because the version of Islam that they saw was today what we would call, al-Qaeda and Daesh and these extremists. Right? So those non-Muslims were oppressed by having a violent version of Islam being introduced to them. Future generations of Muslims and non-Muslims were oppressed. So don't think of it as an injustice done to Imam Hussein. this comprehensive understanding of rights, this is the way that God ordained our lives to be. And all of these lives, these rights were undermined by the injustice that was done by the enemies of Ahlul Bayt. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. So coming to your organs and your limbs, now there is detail and a great deal of beauty in the text. So I'm just summarizing because we can't do 50 rights, in complete detail. But the first of the limbs that the Imam mentions is your tongue. And the Imam says that you honor your tongue. This is a gift given to you by Allah. The power of speech and of thought is a unique honor that Allah gave humanity. And you honor it by avoiding evil, making your tongue have the habit of saying good, and giving your tongue a rest. Don't talk all the time. Now, these days, sometimes we have a tendency to have too many opinions and of being too expressive. In an oral culture, that would be with the tongue. Today, we can extend that expressiveness to the tongue and to our hands, to what we swipe or we type, or however you express. That is literally or figuratively the role of the tongue. So sometimes, keep quiet, observe and learn, and be humble. That is part of the right of the tongue, not to overstimulate it and overuse it when it is not proper. And then when you want to express yourself, whether it's online or on social media or in person, the Imam says, look at two things. Number one is that you have mawdi' al-haja, where there is a need, wal-manfa'a, or there is a benefit, lid-din wad-dunya. Either in your worldly affairs, there's a need or a benefit. In your religious affairs, there's a need or a benefit. Then express yourself, talk. Otherwise, be comfortable with silence. That's an important lesson for us today, because many of us were very reluctant to be silent. So that's therefore the tongue. For the hearing, the Imam says that your hearing is the gate to your heart. So recognize that when you listen to something, don't think of it as entertainment. Don't think of it as neutral. It is opening a passageway to your heart. In the words of the Imam, he says, tanzih, keep clean, purify your ears عن أن تجعله طريقا إلى قلبك, from making it a pathway to your heart, except for something that is fawha karima, a noble word. So a lot of people, we have entertainment, people have songs, they have movies, they have so much media that we consume, knowingly and unknowingly. And we just kind of assume I'm passing time. I don't have anything else to do. Or I'm having fun. We don't realize that is a direct path that we are opening to our heart and to our soul, and it is going to affect us. And its effect is going to be either positive or it is going to be negative. As the Imam says, فَإِنَّهُ بَابُ الْكَلَامِ إِلَى الْقَلْبِ. Your ears are the gateway of speech to your heart. يُؤَدِّي إِلَيْهِ ضُرُوبَ الْمَعَانِي. Your ears are going to convey different kinds of concepts to your heart. عَلَى مَا فِيهَا مِنْ خَيْرٍ أَوْ شَرٍ. Either with benefit or with harm. So be aware of that reality. Then after the hearing, we have the eyes, the sight. And if the ears are the gateway to your heart, the Imam says that the seeing or the eyes, فَإِنَّ الْبَصَرَ بَابُ الْاِعْتِبَارِ. Your eyes are the gateway to taking heed or to mindfulness, or to i'tibar is getting an ibrah. getting a lesson or taking a moral from something. So don't look at things just because they are beautiful, or just because they are interesting, or just because you're curious. But choose what you rest your eyes on so that you have ibrah and i'tibar, so that it makes you mindful. And this is where aesthetics and art are very important. If you have a bedroom, if you have personal space in your car, at home, I don't know, your screen on your phone, on your laptop, if it can be something that when your eyes rest on it, it reminds you of your values. And decorate your space in your life within your home and in your broader environment, so what you see gives you i'tibar. The Imam says your eyes, they were created by Allah to be فَإِنَّ الْبَصَرَ بَابُ الْإِعْتِبَارِ. It was there for you to have a gateway to be taking heed and getting lessons on what is good. Then the Imam mentions the right of your hand. He says that the right of your hand is avoid both punishment of God and reproach from human beings by avoiding things that are prohibited. But then the Imam says that the right of your hand, this is a very powerful organ, a limb that Allah has given you. This is what allows human beings to create culture and civilization and technology and to have all of the needs and comforts that we have. The Imam says that the right of your hand is to waqqiruha, honor it from waqar, to give honor and esteem and respect. بِقَبْضِهَا عَنْ كَثِيرٍ مِمَّا يَحِلُّ لَهَا, this is a mistake in the text, وَبَسْطِهَا إِلَى كَثِيرٍ مِمَّا لَيْسَ عَلَيْهَا. So, avoid many things that are halal and do many things that are not wajib. Take your standard in your actions and don't just say, all right, I have 5 daily prayers, that's what I need to do. I have 30 days of wajib fasting, that's what I'm going to do. I have khums, that's what I'm going to do. Your hands, the power that Allah has given you, both literally and figuratively, much that is not an obligation, do it. Much that is not prohibited, avoid it. So that you come and this is how you do tawqir, or honor your hands. The next right is that of the leg. And for the leg, the Imam says, obviously don't walk to those places that are prohibited. Remember that these legs are what are going to carry you on Sirat. Sirat is that bridge to the hereafter, where some of you are probably familiar with the concept. You will pass over hellfire. And those who are sinful and those who are evildoers, their feet will not be able to carry them on that bridge, and they will fall into hellfire. So, you know how some of us, we might have like a old high mileage car that we use for local commute, but we wouldn't want to take it on a long distance travel. And then we have maybe a more reliable car. We say, all right, if I have to travel to New York, that's what I'm going to drive on. So you choose your conveyance based on what you're expecting from it. If you have a car with worn out tires, you're not going to drive it in stormy or icy or snowy conditions. Well, your legs are your conveyance on Sirat, as Imam Zain al-Abidin says. How strong do you want your legs to be? You want your legs to shake or falter, or you want them to carry you on Sirat? The way that you're going to assure that you can walk on Sirat is by honoring the commandments of Allah in this world. The stronger your legs are from abstaining from sin in this world, the stronger they will be in the hereafter. Then the Imam mentions your stomach, and he says that don't make it a store of haram, of course, And then the Imam says, even with what is halal, be moderate. Sometimes, once we find out something is halal, we pig out and eat past our fill. The Imam says that make sure that not only do you avoid what is haram, both a little and a lot, but even avoid much that is prohibited. And when it comes to your private parts, the Imam says to avoid all of that which is prohibited to you. And then the Imam says, seek help. How do you seek help? This is a passion. And sometimes it's difficult, especially in a world that's filled with so much temptation and where you have millions of dollars of being spent to use our baser inclinations to get us to say things, do things, and especially buy things that we would not otherwise want to do or that are not in our best interest. So the protection of our chastity, our modesty, the Imam says that the way that you seek help in that is that, first of all, lower your gaze. Make a habit of not always staring and looking at everything that piques your curiosity. Remember death. Remember the threat of God's punishment. Make yourself fear the punishment of God. And then, of course, وَبِاللَّهِ الْعِصْمَةُ وَالتَّأْيِيدُ. Allah is the one who provides protection and support, and so inshallah, that will help you maintain your modesty. After that, the Imam moves on to the rights of your actions, and inshallah I will move a little bit faster through this. The rights of your actions, they start with the best of your actions. What are the best of your actions? Your worship. So first is salat. Stand before Allah as a slave. Know that when you pray, you are visiting Allah. It's wifada, or a delegation, a gift, a visitation of Allah. So when you stand before Allah, see yourself as a slave. And you honor that gathering by not fidgeting, but be still and be humble. Then the Imam mentions Hajj. This is an even greater form of wifada, a visitation, a delegation that comes from humanity to Allah. And Hajj is fleeing away from your sins to come to God. Next worship that's mentioned is fasting, and very beautifully Imam Zainul Abidin says that fasting, notice the Imam does not focus on hunger and thirst. That's what we often focus on, and sometimes we might lose our temper, we might snap at somebody, but we're still fasting. In fact, we might lose our temper because we're fasting, and we're hungry, and we have a headache, and we have caffeine withdrawal or whatever. The Imam, he says that fasting, this is hijabun. It's a veil, a protective veil, that Allah has placed over your tongue, and over your ears, and over your eyes, and over your private parts, and over your stomach, to protect you from the fire. So what happens? Sometimes, if I'm not careful about what I see, or what I say, or if I'm not modest, if I do that, then it's kind of like you're poking that curtain. And if you keep poking that curtain and playing with it, what happens? It wears out, it breaks, and then you don't have that protection from the fire. It's a very beautiful example that Imam Zainul Abidin, he gives us to see the deeper meaning of fasting. That through this practice of abstaining from food and drink and certain other things, it's really our senses and our limbs that we are protecting. And if we compromise on that, then we're destroying the veil protecting us from hellfire. Then the Imam mentions charity. He says that your charity is your treasure. It's a trust that you have placed. It's there with you. It's there for you with God. So you know how sometimes We think that what I give in the way of Allah, I've spent it. Sometimes people will say, how much charity can I give? Whether it's to family members or needy people or masjid or any other worthy cause, what more can I give? The Imam says no. That is what you are saving and storing for yourself. What you spend on a fancy car, a fancy meal, a fancy vacation, that's being spent. Because that's not going to come back to you in the hereafter. But what you give in the way of Allah, that's there for you. Then the Imam very beautifully says, don't lord it over anybody. If I say to you, remember when I gave you a loan? Remember when I helped you with the down payment on your house? Remember when I paid this for you? The Imam says, if you truly believe that God is going to store that charity for you, then you haven't done a favor to anybody else. The minute you say, I did this for you, you are saying that I don't really believe this is something that God is giving to me. It's not my savings, it's something that I have given to that person. And then the Imam says that that's how Allah is going to treat you. You've just given up that very important resource for you in the hereafter because you're reminding somebody of your generosity and lording over them rather than considering it to be a gift. So you can read this section. This is one of the very beautiful sections of Risalat ul-Huquq, but we'll move on. Then the Imam mentions the sacrificial animal that you give in Hajj, and then all of the actions that you do. Your general actions, not the specific prayer or fasting, but a good deed that you do. You volunteer, you vacuum, or you throw away the garbage in the masjid, or any good deed. That's not a specific salat, saum, hajj, and so on. The Imam says that remember that Allah, His pleasure is sought, and He wants for us that which is yasir, not that which is asir. Don't make things hard for yourself, complicate your life, and think that you are going to impress Allah. Allah has made Islam and the path to approach Him easy. And وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ يُرَادُ بِالْيَسِيرِ وَلَا يُرَادُ بِالْعَسِيرِ كَمَا أَرَادَ بِخَلْقِهِ التَّيْسِيرِ وَلَمْ يُرِدْ بِهِمْ التَّعْسِيرِ. Allah has wanted to make things easy for you, not to make things difficult. So try to bring spirit and quality in your actions. Don't just try to do a whole lot and, fill a portfolio or a resume, and that quantity is not going to impress Allah. It's not going to be a benefit to you. Okay. Then coming to your leaders. One is the sultan, and that is your governmental authority, a king or a caliph at that time. The Imam says, remember, you are a test for the caliph, so don't provoke the wrath of your rulers. Act with wisdom. That's especially important today. If you have a crazy king, then know that there were many caliphs in history who were equally arrogant and crazy. It's not the first time in history that people have been subject to a political system or a political leader that is not entirely reasonable or rational. Maintain your principles, but don't just lash out and provoke the anger or the wrath and then make life difficult for yourself and others. In one version of the hadith, the Imam says that if you lash out, even if what you're saying is right, but you provoke the wrath of the government, then you're responsible for a share of the harmful effects. Because if they're not acting with justice and they're not acting with wisdom, you should act with wisdom and with contemplation of the consequences. You should be the adult in the room, even if others are acting with arrogance or even childishly. Question?
So, even if you do avoid, provoking their wrath, does an unjust leader, like a tyrant, do they still have the same rights as, for example, a just leader?
The Imam does say that this is one of those areas where there is some difference in the versions. because there were times of taqiyya, various reasons. So when I said there's 90% agreement in the text, this is one of those areas where there is a slight difference. I'm not going to get into the details of that difference, but in one of the versions, it does say, وَأَن تُخْلِصَ لَهُ النَّصِيحَةِ, that your government, you should be giving sincere advice. And we find that Imam Ali, even when there were unjust governments, he gave them good advice. He gave them real advice. So it's not, some of you may have heard of this theory of accelerationism. It's a idea in political thought that if there's an evil system, just add fuel to the fire, make things worse, make it collapse spectacularly. That's not how Imam Ali dealt with the governments of his time. That's not how Ahlul Bayt dealt. They always gave good advice, real advice. Same thing Imam Zain al-Abidin, Imam Muhammad Baqir in their time. So that government doesn't have a right on your shoulders because they're not a legitimate government. But they also represent stability in society. They also, in some sense, have a responsibility for the ummah. And you have a responsibility not to that leader, but to God, to society, to the greater goods of Muslim ummah, of humanity. So you should give good advice, sincere advice. Then it's up to others to take it or not take it, but you are elevating the discourse in society. Even if they don't listen to you, you've had a positive effect on society. Islam does not teach, and the Imams did not practice accelerationism. Just try to rapidly make society decline. Then the Imam mentions your teacher, sa'isuka bil ilm, honor and respect. And then very beautifully the Imam says, when you have a teacher, you are to be a messenger. If you learn something that is from Islam, that is true, then consider yourself now, you have a message, you have to deliver it to those who are needy. I see a lot of people these days, they want to learn kind of for themselves. So I want to learn. Do you want to volunteer to teach children Quran, to teach in Sunday school, to share your knowledge? No, I want to learn. Well, learn, it's important, but then keep in your mind that what you have learned, now you are entrusted with knowledge. So it doesn't have to be today, but make part of your plan and your priority that you want to share, you want to teach, you want to volunteer to spread that knowledge. It's not just for yourself, but it is a trust that you convey to others. And then I'm not going to discuss, but just for completeness, I mentioned that one of the rights that you might have in a society where slavery existed is that you might be a slave and therefore you have an owner. Or you might be a slave owner and then you have a slave. And the Imam mentions both parts. But very beautifully, one is that if you have an owner, then that is one of the people that have authority over you. And then if you are a slave, or if you are an owner and you have slaves, look at the very bottom line. The Imam, this is a society for various reasons, Islam did not immediately abolish slavery. It's a separate discussion as to why that was the case. What were the reasons? But look at how Imam Zain al-Abidin describes that. He says that if you have a slave, know that that slave is a creature of your Lord. Right? خَلْقُ رَبِّكَ وَلَحْمُكَ وَدَمُكَ. That slave is your own blood, is your own flesh. And the version that Shaykh Saduq narrates, Ibnu Abik wa Ummik. Your slave is the son of your father and your mother. You are brothers and sisters. You're shared, and you don't think that you are a higher caste or you are superior. And therefore, and then the Imam says that لا خلقت له سمعا ولا بصرا ولا أجريت له رزقا. You did not create his eyes or his ears. You are not the one providing sustenance to your slave. Most people probably thought, okay, I'm the slave owner, I'm feeding and housing. These days, even not for slaves, you have certain wealthy people, they say, I'm a job creator. I'm providing a livelihood to my employees, and they might feel kind of superior to their employees. The Imam says, forget your employees who are not your slaves. Even if you have a slave, you are not providing their rizq. Allah is providing their rizq. You have just been given that test and that honor by Allah to be the means for them to get it. So you can see the way in which Imam Zain al-Abidin conceives of slavery. It's a necessary evil in a pre-modern society, but it is a means to get people who are very weak in society, give them some honor and dignity, and then to bring them into the mainstream of society with skills and with an ability to take care of themselves. And then later on in that section, the Imam says, give them their freedom if they are ready for it and if the circumstances permit. So to move back, your dependents and your family, employees, whatever they may be, show mercy, be just to them, don't be quick to punish them. If you have students, the Imam very beautifully says, think that you are the treasurer. You don't own the knowledge that you give. It's not your knowledge, it's God's knowledge. God has just made you kind of holding the purse. And so now you are to disperse that knowledge where appropriate, where there is a worthy student. It's a very beautiful example that you just, have the checkbook, you disperse that rizq of knowledge that comes from God. And then when it comes to your marital relationship, the Imam says, know that your spouse is sakan wa uns. It's a source of repose for you, a companionship for you. You should give thanks to Allah for each other, that He has given you a spouse, and be merciful. And then the Imam mentions the right of the husband and the wife. So that brings to conclusion the first 20 rights in Risalat ul-Huquq. I summarized a few of them. Some of the ones that I think it's very beautiful, if you look at in more detail, are the right of fasting, the right of spouses, and then inshallah tomorrow we will look at the remaining huquq. So we can maybe have a few minutes if there are any questions, and then inshallah we can conclude for today.
So back to the do not provoke the wrath of the Sultan. Like, should we not protest? Protest?
No, that's a very good question. Don't provoke the wrath means, sometimes people do and say things for catharsis. Part of your obligation to the ruler and to society is to stand up for what is right. Sometimes, without protest, you actually are just facilitating the oppression to get even worse. So the Imam is not saying, don't stand up for what is right. I mean, the life of all of our Imams was a form of protest, whether it's explicit protest or silent protest, but their very existence and their teaching was a protest. Now, but it varied in the ways based on societal needs. What the Imam is saying is, sometimes I think if I get to go to the White House, I'm just going to stand there and yell, profanities at the president. Right? What is that going to accomplish? That might be, a good video. It might be cathartic, but is it going to help? Is it going to elevate the discourse in society? So sometimes in our society we have that tendency to use humor or mockery without thinking about the effect and the benefit that it's going to have. Even mockery, even humor, and certainly protest have a place. But the point is, think about the effect and try to protest or express what is right in a way that elevates society, that lessens the oppression of the government, that strengthens societal consensus about what is good. Do it in a wise way. Don't just do it to provoke.
Yeah, well, so some of the things that you mentioned, even like mockery, are those already covered in the rights of the tongue or other kind of rights?
Yeah. So those are general rights in general for your tongue, but specifically when it comes to society, sometimes people have a very simplistic view. Government is bad, therefore any kind of protest is okay. Yes. Government might be bad, whether the time of the imams or later times, but that doesn't mean that any kind of protest is okay. Sometimes your manner of protest just makes things worse. It can polarize society, it can make things difficult for normal people and for mu'mineen to live. So don't be simplistic and understand the complexity. And that's where then the other practices of the imams. So Imam Rida had a manner of protest. Imam Zain al-Abidin had a manner of protest. Imam Ja'far Sadiq had a manner of protest. So look at the total practice of the imams and you can see the wisdom of, how do you respond? I don't know if that addresses your question or not, but the short answer is the imam is telling us to be considered and wise in our response. Politics and society are very complex. So don't just say, you know what, I'm going to have a debate and I'm going to show these Sunnis why they're wrong and make everybody Shia. It's not that simple. Stand up for what is right, but not in a simplistic manner. Don't just think that you're going to go and call out the government and then everybody's going to agree with you and everything will be better. No, you have to do so with humility and with wisdom. Any other questions? Go ahead.
The categories you group into various categories, right? Was that explanation to us, or do you think the book also categorized them?
No, all of the categories are there. The only thing that there is a difference of is that sometimes there's an order. So does the right of the hands come first or the feet come first? Sometimes they're different order.
That is the category also the order of precedence?
Yes, but there is a slight difference. One or two of them are out of order. So I mentioned some of the differences, like hand and feet. One version has hands, then feet. One version has feet, then hands. One version doesn't have the mention of Hajj. Right? So these are small textual differences, but 90% or more are the same, and you can say it's kind of an order of precedence. It starts with God, then yourself, then your actions, right? Then your leaders, then your subordinates, and then it'll go on. The next one will be family. So there is an order of precedence that Imam Zain al-Abidin himself introduced in the text. Does that answer your question?
Yes, in a certain way. But I haven't read the book. I think you read it right. So what's your takeaway? When there's a conflict between two rights, does the precedence one take the priority?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So does the one that comes first take precedence? By and large, yes. When you have a conflict between two rights, it's not a very black and white formula you can use. Let's say, for example, Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi Anil Munkar are wajib. But if I do Amr bil Ma'ruf or Nahi Anil Munkar, right, I might have an indirect effect that will alienate somebody from Islam. So now, I want to affirm what is right, but at the same time, I also don't want to cause a backlash in that person or in another person. So how do you balance that? That's something that you need experience and wisdom, and you can't just make an automatic, rule that that this is the priority. But in general, yes, the rights of God, they come first. Then the rights of your own soul and your limbs and your worship, they come next. Then the rights, they go in that order. Right? There's a general principle, but when it comes to specific instances, you have to use sometimes wisdom and insight to see how to balance conflicting priorities. Let me give you a very relevant example. Right? We believe that there are certain lifestyles that are haram. Right? Certain relationships and certain types of lifestyle that are haram. If I make too big a deal about that, right, somebody, even a Muslim, let alone a non-Muslim, might say that, you know what, you're too extreme, you're too violent, even if what I'm saying is reasonable, but it's just so far away from their thinking that they consider it to be unreasonable. They might not even look into Islam. What should I do? I can't change the teachings of Allah because there are wisdoms that that person does not understand. Their culture and their upbringing and their thinking cause them to think something is unreasonable when it is very reasonable and it is very moderate. Eventually they might realize that, but right now they don't. So this is why, for example, just to give you an example, some of the hudud punishments, a number of our fuqaha have said that in the present time they should not be applied, like stoning. It's not because the punishment is extreme or unreasonable, but because the purpose of that punishment is to solidify within society the harm of adultery, how it breaks the family, it breaks the soul of the person and the family and everybody involved, children and adults. But if carrying out that punishment is going to cause a large number of people to be alienated from Islam, then you're throwing away something more important to get something less important. It's still important, but there are things that are more important. Right? So that's a decision that you have to make with wisdom and looking at the practice of the Prophet and the Imams. What did they say was more important, and what did they say was less important? Right? So I think we can conclude with that. But if there are any additional questions, then we can address them tomorrow. Inshallah, we'll look at some of the remaining rights in our session tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I think we did go a few minutes over. Tomorrow, inshallah, hopefully, we'll be able to end on time. Shukriya.